So what is the Radical Reformation? Well, this is a term to describe a whole bunch of different small groups that spring up in the early 1500s following Luther's break with the church. Some of these just exist for a few years or even less time and then disappear because they're put down by the political authorities. Others have had a much more lasting influence. And so, for example, the largest Protestant denomination in America, the Baptists, particularly the Southern Baptists, but there are also a lot of other forms of Baptists, they can be traced back in terms of the primary influence to the Anabaptists, who are one of these groups that would make up part of the Radical Reformation. The Mennonites as well would be traced back to Meno Simmons, who is one of these figures in the Radical Reformation. So we can't go into a lot. There's a whole lot of different groups that we could talk about with important differences between them. This is just a kind of a general overview of this area, and if you're interested, then certainly you can do some more reading and research. But basically what happens is, as I said, when Luther makes his break, this kind of unleashes a flood, if you will, and you end up with a lot of different figures breaking from the church and starting movements. And some of these are much more radical than Luther, right? And so you have groups that basically reject all established church authority, and along with that, they'll also reject all established political authority. And they will take things like Luther's idea of sola scriptura and take them to the extreme. So they will sit down with the Bible and only those things that are explicitly commanded or forbidden in the Bible, those are going to be their only laws. They're going to reject all other doctrines, they're going to reject all other laws, and they're going to live only by the Bible. Now, as you might imagine, the political authorities are not too pleased with much of this. And some of these early movements were militant, and so they would say, look, we're going to start our biblical kingdom, we're going to follow God's word, and we're going to set up our little kingdom right here. And this is our farm and this guy's farm, we're going to start our own little biblical kingdom. Well, not surprisingly, as I said, the political authorities aren't too keen on this, and most of those groups get quickly squashed. What happens in the decade or so after that is you continue to get movements along those lines, but they are pacifist, right? And so they will say, we are going to separate ourselves from society, we are going to live a truly biblical life, if you will, but we're not going to be in armed revolt against the political powers that be, we're going to be pacifists. Now, this too is not very popular with the authorities or with the church authorities, but it doesn't usually bring down quite the same swift, complete annihilation that the militant approach adopted. And so some of these more pacifist groups do survive and do pass down their influence and teachings through subsequent generations. And so we get kind of pacifist Protestant Christianity still existing today that can be traced back to some of these early figures, and taking them further and insisting on a purely biblical way of thinking about Christian life, thinking about theology. And as I said, it's not just the political authorities that reject this. Obviously, the Catholic Church rejects much of this, but the magisterial reformers, that is the main reformers that we tend to think of, people like Luther and Calvin, they reject this Radical Reformation as well, right? They see it as going too far in some of the solas and some of the key ideas that we find in Luther and Calvin. One of the key things that this debate or these conflicts center on is the issue of baptism, right? And so the Radical Reformation, they read the New Testament and they focus on passages that talk about belief and then baptism, right? And so they will say they will only accept baptism that takes place after faith or after belief. And this is where the Anabaptists come for. It's a re-baptizing of people who were baptized as infants, right? So most people at this time would have been baptized as infants, even if they had been born into Lutheran or Reformed families. But the Anabaptists will say those baptisms don't mean anything. Right now, they don't have a sacramental view of the baptism in a Catholic sense. They would see baptism as something you do as following a biblical command, right? That the Bible tells us after you believe you should be baptized. So we do this as an act of obedience and as a symbolic representation to the community that we believe this and we are entering in this community through this symbolic act of baptism. But they would say if you were baptized as an infant, that doesn't count. You haven't obeyed that biblical command yet because it doesn't symbolize a faith that you already have. You didn't have any faith as an infant. Therefore, you need to be rebaptized. And that's really kind of a center point in this sharp debate that springs up between the Anabaptists and the Lutherans and the Reformed, and obviously with the Catholics as well. And so when we get to, say, Trent, and it's the Catholic response to all of this, one of the things that it will include is a rejection of the idea of rebaptizing people. But again, there's a lot more that we could say about Anabaptists and the Radical Reformation. But it's important to at least have a sense that much of what we see in the kind of modern Protestant American world, especially the evangelical world, is really sort of a mix. It's a mix of a lot of Calvin's ideas about salvation and predestination, at least in many places, mixed with these more radical approaches to the Reformation, particularly the idea of believers' baptism. And so American Protestant world is representing this whole spectrum of ideas of Luther and Calvin and the Radical Reformation, all sort of mixed together with all sorts of different emphases. All right, so we will leave that very brief overview of the Radical Reformation for now, and then turn to the final strand in the Reformation that I want to look at, namely Anglicanism. Now, our time grows short, so I'm not going to give Anglicanism anything like the attention it should receive, but I do want to at least briefly mention it because it really is kind of a distinct and separate thing from Luther and Calvin and the Radical Reformation. Now, obviously, it's influenced by those movements, right? So Anglicanism comes in the decades after Luther and Calvin have made their breaks and have kind of started promulgating their thought. And so the figures in England that break from the Catholic Church are certainly influenced by Luther and Calvin and the Reformation going on the continent. But there is a distinct twist here, right? And of course we all know, I'm sure, the story of the Anglican break from the church being centered on the question of Henry VIII's divorce and the church refusing to grant an annulment to his existing marriage. He wants to get married to someone else. The church refuses. And so the Reformation has been happening on the continent, and so he decides, well, we can have our own Reformation here and get rid of papal authority. But given that impetus, if you will, for the Reformation, there's a very different result, or at least in some parts a mixed result, right? So this political need for a break from Rome's authority kind of launches Anglicanism. Now, along with that, right, they want to keep pretty much the rest of the faith, and so early on, Anglican thought is essentially just continuing what the church had taught about various aspects of theology and the sacraments. We're just going to get rid of the bit about papal authority. But once that break happens, there are many who have been influenced by Luther, have been influenced especially by Calvin and his thought. And so they see this as an opportunity. And what you end up with within the Anglican tradition very early on and continuing to this day is that you get these different strains, right? On the one hand, you have those who see the break primarily as an issue of authority, and they want to maintain what we would see as a very Catholic theology and understanding of the sacraments. They just don't want to have the ecclesial authority in Rome. On the other hand, you have those within Anglicanism who are much more influenced by Luther and Calvin, right? And they would see there needing to be a much bigger break with the theology that had come before. And they would see an Anglican church that in its theology and in its practice of the sacraments is much more like a Lutheran or Reformed church. And those two elements within the Anglican Church were in great deal of conflict in the early decades. And so there's a swing back and forth. One will gain the ascendancy, and then you'll get a swing to the other. And a lot of this is tied up with British politics of the time. You know, Cromwell and his rejection of the monarchy has a very kind of reformed Reformation approach to it. But that gets squashed, and the more traditional Anglicanism comes back with the monarchy. And these things go back and forth in a lot of detail that we can't get into here. But all of this to say that what we find in the Anglican world are these two distinct strands that continue to this day, right? And when we see many of the debates rocking in the Anglican world up until this year, there's still this tension. There's the tension between those who maintain a theology and view of the sacraments very similar to the Catholic Church, who want to maintain traditional things like a male priesthood and episcopacy, that would reject homosexual marriage, those sorts of things. On the other hand, you have those who had a more radical break and who are still much more open to changing the tradition and taking the opposite view on many of those issues. And so you get in the Anglican Church kind of a microcosm of the whole Western Christian world in this struggle between traditional kind of Catholic views on the one hand and these Reformation or Radical Reformation views on the other. But again, there's a lot more to be said about Anglican theology and Anglican history, but we can't really do that justice here. So then, we will wrap this up for now, having two whole modules on the Reformation, which obviously is a huge subject, but hopefully it will at least give you an entry point into doing some of your own reading and research if you're interested in pursuing this further. And of course, as always, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and your questions on all of this on the discussion board.